Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Big Pharma, the two words we Americans love to hate on. A majority of our country responds with anger and suspicion when asked what we think about the pharmaceutical industry, using terms like corporate capture, revolving door, profits over people to describe their influence. All this despite the fact that we seem to love taking their products, fueling a nearly $1 trillion industry. Today, we delve into the state of our love, but mostly hate relationship with Big Pharma. What are the key concerns at play here, driving our mistrust? Where are we right to be mad, and where's our mistrust misguided? Is there a better system out there? Our guest today is a bioethicist who studies corporate influence in public health. He says it doesn't have to be this way. Let's get started.
All right, welcome everybody.
Hi, Tom.
Hi. Brenda's instructed me I am to do this intro today. So this is big change for the podcast. Big. So welcome. We got a great show. Maggie, do you want to say hi? Maggie is the virologist.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maggie, the virologist.
Mark is a doctor. Hello, Mark.
Hey, guys.
And Brenda and I are journalists. Brenda, how are you doing?
I'm so good. I'm always good. This is I love doing this. This is the best.
That's good. You know what day it is today?
What day?
Today,
yep,
as we tape this, is March 11th. That is 5 years to the day when a big frying pan smashed America in the face when COVID really hit our shores. Do you guys remember that day?
Hell yes.
I mean, how could we forget? I mean, that was like the entrance of the dark tunnel. I mean,
yeah.
Right. I was at CBS News, and it's called the Broadcast Center on 57th Street. And I was the senior broadcast producer for the CBS Evening News. And basically that day they shut down the broadcast center. They gave us, it was like a couple of hours before our show at 6:30. And we evacuated the building. We left our offices and we found a hotel room. I mean, in hindsight, this was probably a terrible decision. We were a few of us crowded into a hotel room, and we figured out how to broadcast the news. But I just remember at the time just feeling like we just had no idea what was happening, and it was scary. But at the same time, thought we were going to be back at work on Monday.
Yeah.
I was in New York. I was at ABC, and I'll never forget this. There were a lot of comparisons to the 1918 pandemic, and oh my God, this is a once in every 100 years. And look, it's right on schedule. We looked at a graph, and it said in 1918 the pandemic actually took 2 years. Sorry, it was 1918 and 1919, and then everybody in the room was like, "Oh, that was 100 years ago. This will be over in one season, and we'll be done."
I know.
Look at here we are 5 years later.
Yeah, I was in a hotel room in DC. We were filming The Circus. I remember one of our colleagues on our conference calls this could really disrupt the rest of our run. This is a big deal. We're all like, come on, you're overreacting. We just have to cover it. And then all of a sudden it's like Trump does an Oval Office address, stock market's crashing, the NBA suspends its season. Tom Hanks announces he's tested positive. And
but I'll also say, Tom, in texting with some of the folks that we've, gotten to know throughout this podcast, folks are a little bit skeptical of public health and stuff like that. For a lot of them, particularly if they weren't in the Northeast, this was like any other day. It was not.
They were seeing it from afar.
Yeah.
Right.
Very short-lived.
Right.
That was a very short-lived dream, I guess.
And look, Tom, in some ways fits in very nicely with our episode today because, and look, it is a red hot episode today, guys. We wanted to also acknowledge the 5-year anniversary also because this topic itself kind of metastasized, I would say, after COVID. The topic of Big Pharma stirs the pot like none other. I mean, it has it all. And I was going to say we activated our community of skeptics on it, but the truth is, the majority of Americans are skeptical about Big Pharma. It's not a minority opinion. I have trust issues with Big Pharma. As a journalist, I've covered their sometimes shady practices many times, including, might I add, with a couple of y'all on this call. Dr. Mark, you and I did that investigation into the over-medication of kids in the foster care system with antipsychotic drugs and SSRIs. Remember that?
I can't forget that. I mean, that is a very memorable story that, by the way, affected a lot of change after we did that story.
It sure did. And with Tom Johnson, we've investigated, some really big pharmaceutical companies, and some of it led, some of our reporting even led to a congressional hearing. So the point is, we don't have to go too far to find mistrust on this issue. It is on this podcast right now. I feel mistrust. And here, with the unenviable job of answering our burning questions, is none other than lawyer, Penn State bioethicist of TED Talk fame, author of The Perils of Partnership, Industry Influence, Institutional Integrity, and Public Health. And he's got a very cool accent because he's from Glasgow, Scotland, Dr. Jonathan Marks.
Yay.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Jonathan, I love this line from your TED Talk bio. It says that you write and speak about torture, obesity, fracking, healthcare, and other pressing issues of our time. So we do have a fracking obesity episode coming up, so we may double book you.
Happy to come back. Somebody once quipped that I make my career out of other people's misery, but I would say rather I try and focus on things that may be making other people's lives miserable because I think they're worthy of all our attention.
Here. So look, today, rather than our usual, a deep dive back in time, we thought we'd kind of pull out some of the biggest takedowns of Big Pharma and try and break down how things broke down, separating facts from fiction along the way. Easy peasy, Tom.
Right, yeah. Okay, so first, what's Big Pharma? Obviously we're talking about the big multinational pharmaceutical and drug making companies. There's about 15 or so of them. They're all publicly traded. So that's just kind of baseline of what we're yapping about. If you take a spin through social media of the land of podcasts, as we do, you see some big themes emerging about the collapse in trust with these companies. They are a big driver of the mistrust that we've been talking about on this thing. And we see this notion of them putting profits over people. There's this idea that the U.S. government is owned by Big Pharma. And finally, that these are the people that brought us the opioid epidemic. So these are sort of the big takedowns that we see out there. There's many, many more. It's a massive topic.
And it won't be the only time we take it on, just so you know.
For sure. This was just sort of a first pass to kind of get the ball rolling. But if we start with that first that first hit, which is profits over people. So let's kind of break that down, and then we're going to bring Jonathan in to kind of straighten us all out. But profits. Well, we live in a capitalist society where profit is usually seen as a good thing, right? Not only good, but great and admirable. I mean, Donald J. Trump.
Right.
But it seems like what's okay for other industries is not so okay for Big Pharma right now. Back in 2019, this is before we hit the pandemic, Gallup asked Americans to rank industries in terms of how they regarded them. And they gave them 25 industries in all. And wouldn't you know it, guess who came out dead last at number 25? That was the pharmaceutical industry. 58% of Americans, they rated it negatively. Just 27% saw that in a positive light. So, this is below like the federal government and even healthcare. We can talk about that separately.
Wow.
But, this is bottom before COVID and before the COVID vaccine, which had its own hosts of mistrustful issues that spun out into our media ecosystem.
It's a common thing we hear as doctors, right? So there's a lot of people who are frustrated with medicine, right? So they're happy with, living a healthy life, and they want these medications. And there's sometimes so many barriers to getting the medicine you need, the doctor you need at the right time, at the right price, that it's almost like this is an easy target for a lot of people to say, hey, I'm mad. And you know what? This person over here, this company over here making billions of dollars is a nice person for me to dump my frustration on. But these COVID
but also
vaccines,
Mark, before you even go on, I'd say that I think the other thing I imagine fueling some of this and why pharmaceutical companies are a bit different are I think food and drug companies are different than other corporations, right? We put these things into our bodies, we ingest them. And so I can understand why there's a different standard that we put on them. I think we should be putting a different standard on these companies.
The stakes are high, right? This is your life. This is your health.
There's chemical factories that pump out stuff. I breathe it into my body. It affects my health. We don't necessarily put these standards on those companies right now. I'm not saying you're wrong. I think you're right. I mean, there's something so, I don't know.
I mean, it's like
something so
this
interesting
morning,
about, like a vaccine in your arm.
This morning,
I
took like the food and drug industry was present in my home.
Right.
in the last 24 hours. Like my kid was sore from soccer and she kept like, the pain wasn't going away. So I gave her children's ibuprofen. I took a medication this morning. I ate something this morning. Like it's just in our lives in such a palpable way. But you're right. And look, we're going to get into all this. As you can see, we are just chomping at the bit. Go, Mark.
Yeah. I mean, it's so this, profits. Everybody talks about that, but really, another way to look at it is it's not that they're just making money off of people and putting profits first. It's sometimes it's profits are following like doing good by people. It's people then profits. And that's a really like this debate about how I was talking yesterday to a patient who had metastatic melanoma. This is a horrible disease. 10 years ago, your life expectancy with that was maybe in the single digits. Like we're talking like 1% to 5% survival. Now we have this amazing breakthrough of immunotherapy, which is a game changer for survival of melanoma. Think President Carter. I mean, he wouldn't have lived to this historic age without, these advances in medicine. And that's an example of an opportunity where if you put the science first, you put the people first, it works. The profits come in big. And nobody, I mean, I literally was asking this person, do you feel like, and what do you feel about that this company made billions and billions of dollars on, this drug that they made for you that cost you and your insurance company a lot of money? And they basically just said, how much is it worth it for me to be alive? I would not be alive under that different system. And again, it's why this is so emotional.
Mark, we were talking, about COVID at the top of this, and I know you've looked a little into those just COVID vaccines and in the context of profit
and people. Yeah, both.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this was we keep talking about big pharma. This is how it like entered the dialogue for a lot of people. This is when pharma became on the big stage. It was a shining moment. The vaccines were raced out. By 2023, only, we said 27% of the country who saw big pharma positively, that number was dropping. Now it's 18%. So even though we talk about how great they are, it's like, look, we know that these vaccines saved millions of lives. So, it saved over 3 million American lives, according to nonpartisan organizations, about how effective it was. Yet the makers of that vaccine who did all of that are viewed incredibly negatively by the very people that they saved. So it's a challenging, debate because of all the good that was done and at what cost.
Yeah. And let's hang on that profit part of this for a second. I know I keep coming back to that, but I do think it's central to this conversation. I mean, Big Pharma made let's just say it, they made a shitload of money off the COVID vaccines, and that's just a fact. And very quickly into the rollout, Americans, they're waking up to some of these eye-popping headlines about the profits. In just the first 3 months of 2021, as the vaccine is rolling out, Pfizer says they're on track to turn a $900 million profit. That's just 3 months.
That's like such a hard number to grasp. Like
that's $10 million a day.
Oof.
Yeah.
I think what's so interesting about this is at the same time, Big Pharma is reportedly lobbying the Biden administration to keep vaccine formulas from low-income countries in order to keep those profits high. So that goes back to profits over people. This is where I, as like a public health person dedicated to help saving lives and regardless of their income or nationality, get really frustrated in trying to hold these patents and not share them with manufacturers globally in the middle of a pandemic. Tom Frieden, the former head of CDC, was quoted as saying, Big Pharma is behaving as if they have absolutely no responsibility beyond maximizing the return on investment. And this is so frustrating because even outside of a pandemic, vaccines are not considered big business, and we could be halting way more infections than we do if our mindset were just a little bit different. And I think, that's a nuanced point. And Mark, I think you talked a little bit and looked into this and how, vaccines aren't free.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it speaks to Tom's point earlier, like this is a capitalist society, right? We want people to have a motive to do something really good. And, let's face it, there's no bigger motive than money. If you ask a lot of people, did you expect the companies to just give away the vaccine for free? I mean, I think some people would say yes. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think we should at that moment it was so dire that we should have given it for free?
Well, I think the bigger point, especially about the low income countries, is that it took 2 years for them to loosen the patent restrictions before these countries were able to get them. And this is now, I mean, there have been health organizations that have talked about that was way too slow. And to Maggie's point about vaccines aren't considered a big business, like I would just say, like, if that's because I've heard that now from multiple scientists, and I think to the general public, like that's a really tough thing to swallow. Like maybe as part of $1 trillion pie, it doesn't seem like a lot, but before the pandemic, they were like a $35 to $40 billion a year industry. That's the same as Coca-Cola, and nobody would deny that Coca-Cola is a giant company. So I would just say that like I really see this from both perspectives, like in my core. You know what I mean? So look, in all of 2021 and 2022, now it's a lot more, right? Because we're in the COVID era. Big Pharma turns a $90 billion profit from the COVID vaccine. So I want to bring in our guest, Jonathan Marks. This first claim we're making about profit over people, how should we be thinking about this? I mean, for example, without profit, the industry says it can't invest in what's needed to make life-saving drugs and vaccines. We live in a capitalist society, but we're so pissed off, as our surveys show. So what do you think?
Well, let's rewind a little bit. Thank you. When Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, and he was asked if he was going to patent it, his reply was, "Would you patent the sun?" Right? So it's important to remember that the world we live in now was not always the world we lived in. And it's also important, I think, to acknowledge, yes, there are incredible contributions that these vaccines made. Absolutely no doubt. They save lives. They reduce the burden on the healthcare systems across the world in the countries that were lucky enough to have access to the vaccine. But let's also acknowledge some of the limitations. So first of all, even before the vaccine was, even before the main vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, the AstraZeneca, the Johnson & Johnson, even before they were released, one of the first things I did was I looked to see how many vaccines are having as a principal objective the prevention of transmission. And of course, the vaccines that we had, none of them were incredibly effective at preventing transmission. Their goal was to prevent serious illness and hospitalization. So we ended up with a system in which that task of preventing serious illness and hospitalization, well, it performed at that level, but it didn't prevent transmission. And so we have a system right now where just take, putting my critical lenses on, you would say, well, here's a company like Pfizer, which makes money on both ends. It makes money by selling vaccines at considerable prices to the countries that can afford them. And then when people get COVID, they run ads on television saying, COVID, Paxlovid. And I think there was just a recent study out showing that Paxlovid may not be quite so effective. And I will say, on the one occasion when I got COVID and I thought, should I take Paxlovid? Because I really don't want to get long COVID. That's what I was worried about. And I started to look at some of the studies on what the efficacy was of Paxlovid to reduce the chances of you getting long COVID. And what those studies did was, I think, somewhat calculated. They did not, in many cases, disclose the reduction in absolute risk. They disclosed the reduction in relative risk. And so it made it look like you had a great chance of avoiding COVID if you took the drug, but actually your chances of getting long COVID are small in the first place, and they're reduced a little bit by taking Paxlovid.
Is that a communication issue, or is that something more nefarious?
Well, I think there is a science communication issue involved, as well as a larger question of science education. But I think when you look overall at studies on drugs and vaccines, when they are funded by pharmaceutical companies with a vested interest in the outcome or co-authored by researchers with a vested interest in the outcome, what you see is an impact on the study design, on the findings, and on the interpretations of those findings, often way more favorable, way beyond, in many cases, what the data is able to show. So I'm not necessarily attributing ill will, but what I'm demonstrating, I think, is that what the meta-analyses show is a systemic problem. When we have industry-funded research, you have way more favorable findings.
Yeah.
And I'll just, and I'll say one other thing, they followed the money. I mean, they certainly performed a public health function, but they followed the money. And I am wearing another hat. I am a consultant in the UK COVID inquiry, paid by the inquiry itself, but to represent a group of marginalized people, in this case, in my case, a group of disabled people's organizations. And what's really apparent is, there are many people who are immunocompromised and couldn't take the vaccines. They still can't really go out into the world because COVID is there in the world. But there's really no incentive for pharmaceutical companies to develop a solution for them because it's a smaller population and the rest of the world seems to have moved on. So we have a system and it works in part, but there are many ways in which it doesn't work. And there are many ways in which it gives reasons for people to distrust. And we should be working on getting from the system we have to a better system.
I'm just so fascinated by this intersection because I think research right now is in peril. People are losing jobs in academia. Harvard's on a hiring freeze. Grad students aren't being accepted at a lot of institutions right now because of what's going on with the federal funding. And work's halted, publications are sitting. It's really paralyzing to be in this space. And ultimately, the advice is if we can't rely on federal funding to pursue industry support. And when that's the next best option, I think it's a short-term solution, but I worry about in 10 years, if in retrospect, we'll look back and think it's a nail in the coffin for what trust in research could be. And this kind of moment needs a solution that fosters trust and enables the work to continue. So what sort of solutions do you see now that we're at this intersection where federal funding isn't something we can rely on and the next best option is industry-supported research?
Yeah, and the problem is, some people working in fields now, that may be the only option there is. So I am sympathetic, and I know, if you just compare in terms of food research, a lot of food researchers they've built their careers doing research funded by industry because the people who have the vested interest in showing that eating more nuts is good for your health are the people who represent those very industries. So yes, I do think it's a problem. I think so we have a short-term problem right now. I hope it's a short-term problem, but it's going to leave a lasting footprint. We have a government that in the US that is hell-bent on remaking medicine and public health. There are public funding streams, of course, in other countries, from other governments. So we mustn't forget those. But I think also we have to start thinking about bigger picture solutions going forward. There are other ways of incentivizing research to promote public health. The way in which we've built the system around now is not simply that we've created corporations that have to justify their existence by making profits. We've created a system of protecting intellectual property, which essentially allows for the maximization of profit seeking, not the maximization of public health benefits. And there are other potential systems we could use. One would be to create a prize fund. So instead of pharmaceutical companies being rewarded by having exclusive ability to license or market those drugs, they give up those intellectual property rights in return for being rewarded from a system that objectively determines the public health benefit resulting from their pharmaceuticals, whether drugs or vaccines or other interventions. And they're rewarded from that fund, and the money in that fund comes from governments globally. And where do governments get those monies from? Well, they get them from taxing those very industries. So it is possible to create an alternative system. I don't think we're going to.
I don't get it. I don't get what you mean in terms of, so you put out a drug and instead of the reward being, the number of prescriptions that are written, like somebody's like scoring, like how much healthier society is. And then if your drug was linked to that, you would get money. Is that it?
Well, you just described, somebody in the podcast here just described the situation. You began with how many millions of lives were saved as a result of the COVID vaccine. in the US alone, right? That's based on some objective assessment, looking at the data we have. You could do that with any pharmacological intervention. You could objectively assess what are the benefits, how many people didn't die, how many people got less sick, how much less money did the healthcare systems have to spend treating people who were sick. There is a way of, I mean, obviously you could critique every calculation. There is obviously going to be some subjective dimension to the design of the metric. All I'm saying is that here are alternative ways of designing systems. I'm just going to say, in the famous commencement address by David Foster Wallace, he says there are two fish swimming and two young fish swimming along one day, and an older fish swims by and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And one young fish looks at the other one and says, "What's the water?" And the point is, this is the water we swim in, the very system we have now. And the reason why I invoked Jonas Salk at the beginning and why I'm talking about prize funds now is just to flag that this isn't the only system. And we can't get from here to a better system tomorrow. But why can't we be ambitious? The way the right has been ambitious in transforming politics in America and in transforming the judiciary. Let's think about a bigger plan to get from here to a better system.
Okay.
Wow.
As we said, a lot to chew over. The next big thing that we hear a ton about is that Big Pharma owns the U.S. government. The government's captured. So we can just kind of tease through what's driving that. And first stop, as we've talked about, because it really is the big driver in a lot of this conversation, is the COVID vaccine. I mean, people looked at this and said, wait a minute, explain this deal to me. Our tax dollars went to developing the technology behind the vaccines for years. And then Big Pharma comes in at the last minute, is able to turn that, push it over the end line and make billions of dollars off of it. That's effed up. And in fact, in May of 2023, a study came out that said the U.S. government invested $30 billion to develop, produce, and then purchase all the COVID vaccines. The point was that they wanted to be able to provide it to, the American public for free of charge. But you could really track this against social media, that people started to understand this deal that we effectively cut with the vaccine makers to get this thing to market and allowing them to profit. And a lot of people said, you know what, big government's just working for Big Pharma.
Yeah, Tom, I think that was a big part of it, and a misunderstanding of how research works. We move things forward in academia, and then ultimately industry has to take it over the finish line. And there was a chunk of investment from the government to fund this new way forward during the pandemic and bring decades of work in mRNA vaccines to a solution for something that people were dying. We needed a solution. But yeah, someone could look at that and say, the taxpayer was sharing in the cost of that research. And then again, paying for the product of that research, the vaccine or the therapeutics. And the US government doesn't take equity in private companies that move products from our NIH taxpayer funded research from bench to market, but maybe they should. And that's something I think I'd like to hear what Jonathan thinks about it. But policymakers could establish equity stakes so taxpayers could benefit from these publicly funded breakthroughs.
I mean, we are definitely paying as taxpayers at both ends, right?
Yep.
And in terms of capture is a binary. Are you captured or not? I prefer to think in terms of influence because there's a spectrum, I think. But, let's just, again, rewind the clock a little bit, go back in history to the Affordable Care Act, which some people call Obamacare. Right, that a deliberate decision was made by the Obama government the Obama administration at that point, which was to not antagonize the pharmaceutical industry and totally focus on HMOs, health insurance companies. As a result, Obamacare did not include anything in terms of negotiating prices with pharmaceutical companies, right? So we have the situation where we in the US are paying more than most people are paying for the drugs when the basic research that drug companies took across the line or made Me Too drugs building off of, that was funded by the federal government. Now, one of the last things the Biden administration did was introduce a pilot program allowing the federal government to negotiate prices, but in relation to 10 drugs only. a drop in the ocean.
Mm.
So we absolutely need a better system. And there are many possibilities, but the bottom line is we are paying as taxpayers twice, as patients twice, and we need a better system than that.
Right. And look, just going back to the point that Tom was making about government being owned by Big Pharma, right? We hear Big Pharma bankrolls Congress. I mean, a stat analysis, stat is like a medical journal or a newspaper. Is that how you guys would describe stat?
Yeah, news site. Yeah.
Yeah. And back in 2020, Stat did this analysis and they tried to answer, how widespread pharma donations were in Congress. And it found that 72 senators and 302 members of the House of Representatives took a financial donation from the pharmaceutical industry ahead of the 2020 election. That's more than 2/3 of Congress. And more recent data from Open Secrets, which is like a nonpartisan group that tracks money in politics, they showed that this averaged $45,000 and $47,000 for Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives, respectively, and $50,000 and $69,000 for Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. So that totals nearly $26.5 million to Democrats and $16 million to Republicans in the 23-24 cycle from pharmaceutical and health product companies. And Open Secrets goes on to show that, Kamala Harris received 6 times more donations from pharmaceutical companies than Donald Trump. So, then you've got the revolving door accusation, like people in government, like the FDA, who are empowered to make decisions on behalf of the American public. They're only in government briefly to boost the profits of their friends in pharma before they parachute out of government into a cushy big pharma job as a reward. So, Jonathan, we're talking revolving doors here. We're talking political donations. I mean, has big pharma fully captured, or even softening it a bit if you want, influenced our government?
I don't mean to soften the problem by using the word influence. Not at
Okay.
all. That was not an attempt to soften. It is an incredible
Fair
problem,
enough.
and if the word capture makes that problem more dramatic, then you can use the word capture. So let's just go back a minute to give some more examples, honing in. So when the NIH first recognized that the opioid crisis was a crisis, way back in 2017 or so, as somebody mentioned the opioids crisis a few minutes ago, and I should say, it was 15 years too late. It was apparent from, it was public knowledge we had a crisis in the making 15 years beforehand. But anyway, so the NIH first gets together, and what it does is it pulls together a group of entities to discuss the problem and to try and tackle solutions. And the initial invitees to those meetings included representatives of the pharmaceutical companies who had created or exacerbated the crisis. The Senate and House committees charged with principal responsibility in the years following with dealing with the opioid crisis, it was the same thing. The vast majority of the members had taken money in terms of campaign contributions or lobbying from pharmaceutical industry, the very opioid companies responsible for the crisis. So absolutely, we have a problem. And the revolving door, just to give an example from another industry, there are some people's CVs who look like FDA Monsanto, FDA Monsanto, FDA Monsanto.
Yeah.
So we have a real problem. And there's one thing, it's important to distinguish the economic power of pharmaceutical companies from their political power, because they also have a huge amount of political power. And the only way we're going to tackle some of these problems is to address the political power of those corporations.
Yeah.
But Jonathan, I know in science, when it comes to research, when you've made the point that when industry funds that research, it's more subtle sometimes. Like it influences the questions you ask of what you research, and maybe takes up your bandwidth so you're not asking other questions in your research. It kind of just spoils the system. You've talked about like a web of influence this industry money can create, that has like this more secretive, almost subtle influence. Is that the same thing with business, with government, or like is it in the real world, in the real politic of government and big pharma and people in the revolving door, is it transactional, or is it, I have friends and colleagues, maybe I'll head back there, so I understand what it's like to be working in a pharmaceutical industry, so I'm going to cut them a break on this because I think that's actually maybe more fair? Or like, how does it work in real politics with government and industry?
So it doesn't need to be transactional. I'm sure in some cases it is, but it does not need to be. So Tom, let me give you this example. I'm a billionaire, let's imagine. I give you a
Congratulations, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now it's become far harder for me to enter the kingdom of heaven, as the old saying goes, because I have so much money. But let's imagine that, Tom, I say to you, here's $1 million. Do I have to say anything more to you when you know that not only have I just given you $1 million, but I could give you 10 million next year or 100 million the year after? Are you going to do anything with that $1 million that might upset me?
Right.
And this is what I call the tyranny of the next gift. It's not a benevolent dictator, it's a tyrant, because you won't do anything, not only with that money, but with any other resources you have. You won't do anything to piss me off because you know there's the possibility of more coming from me. So it doesn't need to be, influence doesn't need to be explicit. It can be tacit. And I will say it's not just about the influence directly on government, because the pharmaceutical industry, among many others, is very clever when it comes to this. And often they hire the same PR firms the tobacco industry and others have used in the past to guide them as to how they can influence other entities. And so drug companies don't just try and influence doctors. They influence medical professional associations. They influence patient advocacy organizations. They influence universities. They even influence patient advocacy organizations is a really important case in point, because these bodies make representations to regulators and to government, and they look like they are representing the interests of patients. But in actual fact, even though their influence may be tacit, they themselves have been influenced by pharmaceutical companies from whom they have taken money.
I mean, I can see why your TED Talk is super popular. I mean, it's just you've touched on so many things that, at the interface of, okay, there's, direct to consumer advertising for these drugs on television. Then there's the pharmaceutical rep that's calling you. Then there's, a television commercial about, do you have X, Y, and Z? You may have X and Z disease. All of these ways to tap into this marketing machine. And then you talked about the revolving door. Because it's so complex, can you help us understand about why this is happening? Right? Isn't it normal? If I'm a specialist, you said you were a billionaire. If I'm this amazing scientist, isn't it normal for me to then, help lend expertise to the real world by taking what I know of my vast government experience and then going to work to get a life-saving drug through the hoops that they have to jump through to get that to market? Isn't that good? Why is that not good? And it's not always corruption.
So I just want to rewind. First of all, there's a different way of thinking about corruption that I want to come to in a minute. But just to take your first example, direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs does not happen everywhere. This is a peculiarly American phenomenon. I think New Zealand has it, or maybe used to have it. I haven't checked on New Zealand recently. But, I grew up in Britain. There's no direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs. I saw adverts because my father was a family doctor and the BMJ was in the bathroom. So I got to click through and see.
But is that evidence of the U.S. government being captured by the pharmaceutical industry, that the government allowed that to happen? These ads.
So this was a change in policy, and that change in policy, the pharmaceutical industry influence had a role in that change in policy. Absolutely. And if you notice, drug names used to be complicated so that physicians would sound impressive when they turned to their patient and said, "The drug I have for you is blah 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 blah." Whereas now drugs have names like Yaz and Humira. And they're the kinds of names that have 2 or 3 syllables that you can remember and write down and take to your doctor. And
the commercials are beautiful. As somebody, there's 3 of us here who've worked in network television. I will tell you right now, we've talked about this. If they get rid of direct-to-consumer advertising on network news, that industry is going to collapse. I mean, and I'm talking about news in particular. And look, I just want to address one thing about that, because I think there is this notion that when you work in media, because of the preponderance of direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ads, that there's somehow this collusion between journalists and that we're kind of carrying water for pharmaceutical companies. And look, I don't know what it's like everywhere. I will just say for myself, I have done deep investigations into the pharmaceutical company, into pharmaceutical companies' influence from network news, from inside network news, where they know what I'm doing, and I did them. So I just like, sometimes it is a very easy thing to say, you know what I mean, that like they're captured. The answer is much more in the gray area. But I will also say, as a viewer now, I can understand why it's very disconcerting, because there are so many of these commercials. And I just also want to say, like, those commercials where you have that couple in two different bathtubs, like, I never fully got that. If it's Bat Cialis, why aren't they in the same bathtub? Anyway, Jonathan, what do you think about that? Like, is DTC really, like, is that a real problem? And should RFK Jr. like eliminate it? Because I think he wants to.
So it's one of the first things that I ever wrote about as a bioethicist when I came to the US was direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs. And I was horrified at the time when I started doing research on the law in the US, there was a famous case in which the Supreme Court said, even when public health is at stake, regulating commercial speech should be a last resort. And, as somebody who's a human rights lawyer who comes with a familiarity of European and international human rights law, giving commercial speech primacy over public health seems perverse.
Wild.
Yes. So I think we need to, how much can be done about that in light of the current Supreme Court, remains to be seen. I do want to just go back, though, to if I can, to this question of what corruption means, because I think we have a very narrow view of corruption, and a way of thinking about this problem might be to broaden our understanding. So the typical way we think about corruption is, is when you should be promoting the public interest, but instead you are promoting your own personal gain, taking bribes in the back of the pocket. That's a kind of definition that Transparency International uses, that many NGOs and intergovernmental organizations use. But there's another way in which I think we can think about corruption, and that is putting private interest ahead of the public good, whether or not you gain personally from that. And that kind of activity undermines the integrity of public health agencies, of our universities, and of the people who work there. And I think that's what's really important. And it's, instead of naming the particular physician who's taken $3 million, and I see the value in that, we should think about the economy of influence we have created, where we promote and push to the top of the professions as indicia of their competence people who have received the most money from industry. We have to rethink how we value people in our fields.
I think that's a really interesting point. And I want to, like, one of the things I have heard from scientists and doctors who have been deep in research into coming up with incredible life-saving medications is that there aren't very many entities out there that can afford to create these kinds of life-saving remedies aside from industry. Now, I can think of one other, and that is entirely government. But their answer to that is that, government has regulations, government has a lot of hoops to go through, and that, the need for society to be relieved of their ailments is obviously quite great. And then on the one other hand, like, when I think about Silicon Valley, when I think about this sort of like culture of innovation that we have in this country, where we really want to invest in those moonshots and the cure for cancer and the whatever, sometimes you need those like break fast, what is it? Well, move fast, break things quickly. I know that people aren't into that these days, but you need that kind of mentality in order to make these products. So I guess, Jonathan, what I would say is, like, the idea that you need a shit ton of money to make life-saving medicine, and right now the only real people who can do that is industry. What's your answer to that?
We have to stop thinking of regulation as somehow inimical to our own interests. Regulation is what protects us. Why did two Boeing planes fall out of the sky? Because of an inadequate regulatory system. A regulatory system, if you want to use the word, that was captured. We didn't have people inspecting planes who were independent. We had Boeing employees assigned as representatives of the FAA in order to inspect planes. Regulations are what make us safe. right? Now, yes, you can improve on regulatory frameworks, but we have to stop thinking of regulations in this way. It's a language that only serves to perpetuate the interests of the private sector and to undermine the public good and public health. That's
But
the
if you
first thing I would say.
look at the sort of the current state of play with MAHA, with MAGA, this new administration, we don't want regulation. We don't want industry money in research. We don't want government money in research. But yet we kind of like being the leader in new drug innovation. Like, this just doesn't seem like this adds up to really anything other than just a mess.
Well, so again, there are other systems we could create. So here's another example. It's this one is, I think, originally pioneered by the late Shelley Krimsky, and my colleague Chris Robertson has talked about it too. This idea where you could take the money from pharmaceutical companies before they conduct the studies, and that money would be given to a third party, a federal agency that wouldn't do the research itself, but would assign it to a research team at a university. So there would be an intermediary for the funding that would ultimately be used to conduct research in the academy. Now, there are problems with that system. It's called a money blind. The idea is the drug company shouldn't know who the researchers are, and the researchers shouldn't know who the drug company is. But of course, most drug companies almost invariably patent a drug before they go to clinical trials. So it wouldn't be hard to figure out who the patent holder was. I mean, unless you had some kind of shell company. And of course, from the drug company's point of view, let's take a drug to do with thalassemia, right? There are a small number of experts in the world in teams who could look at a drug dealing with thalassemia. So the pharmaceutical company could do what companies do now, like they give money to Democrats and Republicans alike, knowing that whoever gets elected will put their interests first. They could give money to all the potential teams they thought were working on this project. So it's not a perfect system, but we need to start thinking outside the box about other ways of funding research that don't just tackle the problem of lack of public trust, but actually make the research itself more credible, more reliable. Isn't that what we all want?
Jonathan, I mean, how much of the problem do you think is just a lack of understanding of the process? I mean, what you've just described is like almost like a team effort, right? Like this part will do the research, and we want to separate it out from the pharmaceutical company and have a government agency, assign the research. I mean, to me, what you just described kind of sounds like, an NIH grant process, right? Like where it's, you get a grant, it's given to a university. And then after that, a pharmaceutical company might jump in, take on that risk to get that product to market. Like, it's almost like we're not so far off. Like we keep using this like hyperbole and, these like crazy words about how it's corruption and we need to break everything and start over. How much of it is possible with just some, elegant refinements of the system that we have? Like we're not that bad in so many ways. How do we bridge that?
Well, I like the idea of framing them as elegant refinements, if that means their uptake will be will be more likely. But you're right. We do have a system now where much of the groundbreaking research is being done by governments, or I should say being funded by governments, right? So that's absolutely true. And a lot of the work that the pharmaceutical companies are doing is, as you've described, sometimes just pushing it over the line, as Maggie said, or what we used to call Me Too drugs before Me Too was used in a different context. And
That's a terrible name.
No, absolutely. Well, they got there. The pharma critiques got there first. And what they meant was, here was a pharmaceutical company looking at somebody else making a ton of money from a statin. Wait a minute. Can we tweak that molecule so that we too can make a ton of money making a statin? Right? And that's exactly what they did. And drug companies love drugs that people take every day for the rest of their lives. Why do you think our armamentarium of antibiotics is so small? Well, people only take antibiotics for a week or two. That's not nearly as profitable as statins and the like. So
But on the Me Too drugs, I just want to say, because everybody loves to like use that as an example of, we don't need any more Me Too drugs. And one of the biggest things that we're talking about is money. Right. But aren't the Me Too drugs a way to lower the cost by driving up competition? Right. So suddenly you have 3 statins on the market. That's how you drive down price. isn't it? Like by giving me three options, well, we'll see who's really better. We'll see who's cheaper. And suddenly that person is now victorious. So the Me Too drug is a double-edged sword.
What drives prices, in my view, is not other patented drugs competing with an existing patented drug because they're still expensive. What drives down prices are when the drugs are off patent, they become generic, and other
Right.
manufacturers can market those drugs. That, to me, is what brings the prices down. But to get back to your other point, in terms of, yes, we do have a system where the NIH does distribute money for research. We could tweak the system because, one of my students said to me, wait a minute. The FDA approves drugs and vaccines on the basis of studies conducted by the people who make them, right? And Anjanu, somebody who doesn't know the system, and it seemed perverse to him. So one way of dealing with that would be that instead of them doing the research with their own money, they could give that money to the government, who would hand it out to the same universities, but that government entity would be an intermediary. That would be another way of tweaking the system. Alternatively, many corporations pay less federal tax than I, as a non-billionaire, pay. They could pay more tax, and some of that taxpayer money could be used to fund research in the public interest. There are definitely ways in which we could tweak the system. Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to get at something more fundamental, which is I'm trying to understand, and look, I feel this too. I said this off the top. I have that mistrust too, that if Coca-Cola funded a study about diabetes, I would not trust that study, right? Is that actually the same analogy? I want to actually ask the group, is that the same analogy? And then secondly, like if we were to take the word pharmaceutical out and replace it with AI technology or like a way to go to the moon or whatever, right? Like government gives contracts, as we know, to Elon Musk to come up with like a way to get to Mars or whatever. Like government funds innovation in industry all the time. In this particular instance, I want to just really dig deep because maybe it's like I'm having trouble separating why this one's different. And Jonathan Marks, why is this one different?
So I think your analogy with Coca-Cola is not way off the mark. It's closer than you may think. The food industry, including soda companies, spend a lot of money trying to get us to focus on personal responsibility and exercise because it allows them to carry on selling their high sugar drinks. And those industries use very similar tactics. And a lot of people say when you talk about, alcohol, fast food, tobacco, vaping, and the like, they say, well, hold on, pharmaceuticals are different because pharmaceuticals are corporations trying to help people. Shouldn't we view them differently when it comes to influence? And my answer is that's how you got the opioid crisis. Right? Pain management was a profoundly neglected field in medicine. It still is. There are very few things in the armamentarium. We need more. But putting your guard down when it comes to pharmaceutical companies is how we got the opioid crisis.
What about vaccines? There are a lot of people out there who put vaccines in the same category as the opioids, that they're trying to get us onto something in order to make profits. What's your take on that?
Well, just to be clear, opioids can be incredibly helpful. When my late father was dying of cancer, being on OxyContin was incredibly helpful for him because it helped alleviate his pain, but he was terminally ill, and so we were never going to have to wean him off the drug. The mistake there was that we so many embraced the aggressive strategy of the pharmaceutical companies to expand the scope of prescribing of opioids to people who had non-terminal chronic pain from other sources. And that's how we got the crisis. Vaccines are an incredibly effective public health tool, but vaccines are part of a system that does give people reasons to distrust because they're part of that same system, which I've already described, in which more favorable findings result from industry sponsorship. When I was recommended to get the shingles vaccine by my physician, I thought, well, I'll go and do some research on the efficacy of the shingles vaccine. What I discovered reading a meta-analysis at the time was that 21 of 22 studies had been funded by industry or co-authored by an employee of industry or somebody who had received funding from industry. only one of those studies was truly independent. Now, those studies showed that the shingles vaccine was 90+% effective at preventing you from getting shingles and post-herpetic neuralgia, which is a terrible thing, lifelong pain as a result of having got the shingles. When the vaccine was out in the field, the real world, not surprisingly, the efficacy figures were much less than that. Is the shingles vaccine still a good idea if you want to reduce your chance of getting shingles and post-herpetic neuralgia? Yes. But the efficacy is not nearly as much as the industry-funded studies suggested. We want better science. This is not a time to either do one of the following things. This is not a time to deny the value of vaccines, but it is also not a time to blindly demonstrate one's reverence to the science. It's a time to say, let's see if we can get better science on the efficacy of vaccines and science that people can trust. That's my goal.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I really appreciated you walking us through that. And yeah, full disclosure, shingles is the worst. I've had it. It is just a nightmare. And so being able to be vaccinated to prevent that, a slam dunk. But I think for me, I do research, and some of it in the past has been funded by industry and several of my colleagues too. And we have, an ethical obligation to uphold that what we're looking at isn't influenced by where the funding came from. And so I think it's important to note that there are scientists out there who are doing their utmost, but the money is coming from somewhere. And I don't disagree that we should figure out a better way forward. I think some of the changes in efficacy from the published data to when we roll something out to entire populations is the numbers that we get through in science, right? Like the number of people per study can be small until it ends up on the market. And so I think vaccine companies play a role in funding this research because, again, there isn't a lot of funding out there and it's hard to push these things forward outside of a pandemic. We didn't have an Operation Warp Speed for everything. That came because we were in a crisis mode, and that drove so much innovation that I fear has been kind of set us back in the innovative space. And I wonder what your thoughts are there in balancing how we can ensure we're moving towards ultimate goals for public health, but also promoting industry to innovate and to make things better.
So actually, you raised a really interesting point at the beginning, because of course, what we don't, you pointed out how efficacy might change once you have larger numbers and we see it in the real world. So there aren't enough phase 4 clinical trials. Those are clinical trials, as you know, after drugs have come to market, where they're being exposed to larger populations. We really want to know then, are they as effective as we thought they are? Do they have side effects that we hadn't really anticipated before? And we need better systems for those. Right now, a lot of the trials that happen after marketing are funded by industry, and they're often called seeding trials because the goal is just let's get physicians in the habit of prescribing these drugs more. So I think that's one thing we need. And in terms of incentives to innovate, I want to be clear, creating a prize fund to deal with a particular condition where there's a great public need is a form of incentivizing industry to do that research. It's a form of incentive that doesn't depend on them being rewarded by a patent, because it might be that most of the people who have the condition live in sub-Saharan Africa, where they have no money and their governments have no money, but you want drug companies to work on those drugs and therapies for those populations.
In terms of the opioid epidemic, I mean, that's like the black mark on the industry. I mean, it's like the big tobacco. Everybody knows what that is. The opioid epidemic, everybody knows what that is. And in a way, you needed that to identify the bad actors, the bad policies. How much of the regulations that we have now are a result of that are effective? Like, is what that opioid crisis did to us, did it make us better off now? I mean, did we weed out the bad actors? I mean, are the regulations better now? I mean, we're now in an administration where they want to take away all of those regulations. Does that set us up for another opioid-like crisis?
Great question. It's important to remember that Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to the fraudulent marketing of opioids back in 2007, and then continued for at least another decade to engage in the very same practices that then led to the the world finally, regulators finally paying attention when we all woke up in 2017. Do we have a better regulatory system? No, we do not. Do I have a hope that it will be improved in the coming 4 years? I definitely do not. It's important to remember that some of the good actors are also bad actors, right? So Pfizer, just to take an example, the company that we all associate with the COVID vaccine and with Paxlovid. So way back in not so long ago, I think it was 2009, they reached a settlement with a fraudulent marketing of a painkiller, Bextra, right? Johnson & Johnson, which is another vaccine manufacturer, as you know, was responsible not just for marketing opioids, but for making the raw ingredient that Purdue Pharma's opioids and many other companies' opioids used. And just let's also flag, they are the defendants in the talcum powder litigation, right? Talcum powder contaminated with asbestos that gave women and others cancer. And what did Johnson & Johnson do? Despite their credo, which says they put the interests of patients and consumers first, they transferred all the liabilities from that litigation to a subsidiary in order to limit their exposure. So,
and they still to this day don't believe they did anything wrong. I mean, they've settled, but if you look at Johnson & Johnson's site and anything, they don't actually believe that they were at fault.
Yeah. So in other words, we have a system in which many of the people we think of on the one hand as good actors are also bad actors. Here's the thing I would say, though, maybe is another way of thinking about it. When people ask me what I want to do in the world, I say, my job is to help create organizations, institutions, community societies that promote the kinds of ethical behaviors I want to see in myself and in others. And we have a system that doesn't necessarily promote the most ethical behaviors. And we need a better system. And part of that is a better regulatory system.
Jonathan, we've talked about the failures of government. We've talked about the failures of pharma. I read in a paper you wrote that medicine's conflict of interest policies, whether those are policies that apply to clinical practices or research or public health policy, those conflict of interest policies proved insufficient when up against Big Pharma's corporate influence. So with medicines failing to hold the line against Big Pharma and the opioid epidemic, why should anyone trust medicine now? Is that a fair? Are we right to be mistrustful of medicine based on the opioid example?
I think there's a place for healthy skepticism. As a friend of mine once said, though, toasters work. He was saying this in response to science, technology, and society scholars who critique science too, right? So clearly, there are interventions that work. But we have a system that promotes certain kinds of interventions, right? Most physicians are rewarded, and surgeons, for example, in a fee-for-service system. The famous playwright George Bernard Shaw once said, if you pay a man to take off your leg, don't pay him not to take it off. Don't be surprised when he removes your leg. Well, I will say that's an oversimplification. I had to have back surgery ultimately, but I met a lot of surgeons beforehand, very good surgeons, who, even though it was in their interest to operate on me, discouraged me from having surgery as long as possible. So there are many, many good people who do not respond purely to economic incentives. But we do have a system that does create these perverse incentives. And I think we should work hard not to demonize individuals, but to create a system which creates better incentives for the behaviors that we'd like to see in ourselves and others. I think that's how I would put it. And in terms of the system, I don't think it's a time we shouldn't be denying science or medicine. We shouldn't be throwing out the whole system. As I say, it's not a time for science denialism, but we should be working to improve it. And the standard response to this conflicts of interest has been disclosure.
Yeah.
And the problem in medicine
you hear that today with MAHA and RFK. Disclose this. Yeah.
Disclose. And, obviously disclosure is important, and that is a baseline ethical responsibility. But what we have to do is we have to deal with a system in which that is no longer adequate. We need something more. There are many advisory committees. I have 3 articles I just printed off this morning from the BMJ on my desk, all about advisory processes in which the majority of members have industry conflicts. And that doesn't mean that all those members vote along with the industry actors who funded them. In many cases, they are the voices actually who have voted against the very intervention in relation to which they have received funding. But the point is that system invites distrust. So we need a better system. So in that better system, for example, people who have a conflict of interest should obviously not be participating in the decision-making process in an advisory process, but they could be making representations to other people who are making the decisions. There are ways of structuring these systems.
Yeah.
So as I say, we don't need to throw away medicine right now. What we need to do is work on improving it.
It's
Right.
so complex. So those people, for example, like, on the advisory committee, people who have actually done the research, right? So it's like first person information. And I get it. There's a lot of ways that can be misconstrued. Look, anytime I have to give a talk, I have to write, these are my conflicts of interest, and I just put them out there, and right now they're zero, but it's not enough, as you said. But I mean, I think, but if we're going to be real, like, and we're practicing modern medicine, like, we can't do it without big pharma. You can't do it without, technology. You can't have a stroke, be rushed into the hospital, get the, clot busting medicine within 3 hours. We just can't do it. And without the influence and the contributions of industry. And I think Tom's point of, well, do you trust your doctor? How do you think doctors should communicate with their patients about this industry in a way that keeps people engaged in the good, but mindful of the bad?
So there's a cartoon in which a physician is handing a patient a prescription, and the caption is, "Try these. I just bought 100 shares."
Okay, but not that way.
No, not that way. No,
this is like Gordon Gekko's capitalism here. Can any? I mean, I don't be too dire, too hyperbolic. Like, that is who we are as a country. We are capitalist, and I don't know how you do this differently, right? I mean, you can nibble around the edges, make some reforms, give more transparency, but like, it sort of feels performative. It feels like at the end of the day, we depend on these pharmaceutical industries to make a crushing amount of money and to give us the best drugs in the world, to keep us healthier, alive longer. And government's job is to sort of facilitate this whole thing, this whole process of everyone making money, everyone living longer, right?
Well, let's just be clear in terms of making money. There's a lot of money being made in the healthcare system in the US right now. Our healthcare system costs us 2 or 3 times what most other developed nations are able to do, and they have they have outcomes that are either as good or even better than our outcomes. So there's a lot of money in the system that is not producing the best health outcomes that we could possibly have. And, I do want to just rewind the clock again, because it's important to remember Bud Relman, who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, told me, many years ago, the system didn't look like this. He wrote a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the leading journals, back in the early 1980s, in which he warned of the medical industrial complex that he thought was arising. That is the complex that we now have fully entrenched. We're not going to transform it overnight, but there are ways in which we can plant the seeds for a greater vision. I come back to the point I made earlier. There are so many organizations on the right in the US who have these aggressive visions for transforming America, and they are in the middle of doing it right now as we speak. It is time for us to sit down and create an alternative vision of what this landscape looks like. And we're not going to get there tomorrow, but it is a vision for where we should be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years. And part of that means more public funding for research, trying to insulate researchers from industry influence, trying to get some of the money out of the places where it shouldn't be, in order to minimize influence. People often say to me, well, you can't, all money is tainted. My goal is not to get rid of taint. Of course, all money is tainted. If you go back, you look at my own university, it's on lands of native peoples. Many universities are built on the backs of slaves. What we can deal with is influence. Let's try and minimize the influence of industry while still bringing in the resources. And if that means taxing them more, that's maybe the solution. But that's the goal. Minimize industry influence, maximize public health outcomes.
Boy, I think that is a really terrific point. And I think to that idea of, putting forth a positive vision as opposed to only defending a status quo that's broken is really, really incredibly important, I think, for folks in science to dig deep on. Because yes, you're right. We have a pharmaceutical industry that supports these drugs that we need in our society. But I can also get behind a coalition that wants to cure cancer. I can get behind somebody saying, we can have a drug out there that can make it so that you only need to get one shot and that'll solve all your vaccine needs. And like, if it's put that way, it feels different. It feels like we're trying to build something as opposed to we're trying to kind of force someone to take something because it makes us money. Look, I want to just really thank Dr. Jonathan Marks.
Yes,
I really admire
so
you. You are an independent thinker, and I really value that. So thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate the honorary doctorate you just gave me.
Oh, wait, are you not a doctor?
We give it to all our guests.
Dr.
Yeah.
Jonathan Marks, come on.
You're a
I'm a
doc
professor,
now.
but not a doctor. I'm a lawyer by training and became a bioethicist. But you know what? Thank you for the honorary doctorate. Just tell me which university it's from and I'll go and pick it up.
It's the first one we've given on this
I know.
podcast.
It was. It
The
is.
first,
Well, that's
why
what
should
It's a
I
big
do
deal.
here.
It's a big deal.
You come into the show not a doctor, you leave the show a doctor. That's all it takes. Listen, I want to thank our listeners. I hope this episode was good for you. I hope that it really kind of fired your synapses. I know it did for us. Please send us your thoughts, your questions to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. And please leave us a rate, a like, a subscribe. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your dog. Just listen to our podcast. I'm Brenda. He's Tom. He's Dr. Mark. She is Maggie Bartlett. I want to thank Jonathan Marks from Penn State for joining us, and we'll see you right here next week.